I was never one to really believe in the paranormal growing up as a kid. Watching the horror movies with ghosts and spirits never disturbed me before, and I didn't get the fear that many of my friends did when watching a paranormal flick. And it wasn't until I participated in my very first college tour that I became a firm believer. I was only 17 at the time that this happened. It was over spring break. Our school offered a chance to sign up for college tours for the junior class only, so we could go out and visit different campuses. Most of us did this because our parents couldn't have afforded to send us otherwise. Plus, it was nice to be away from home with all of my friends on our own. For some of the colleges, we were permitted to stay on campus in their dorms as we stayed overnight. One particular college was in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Now, most Americans know about the Battle of Gettysburg, but not as many hear about the whispers of ghosts in that town. My friend Harold and I were just goofing off on the bus ride there when he mentioned it being a ghost town in general. I told him he was full of it and that ghosts didn't exist. He laughed, but insisted that the place was still haunted. Apparently, he and his family had visited the city on a separate occasion, and he claimed to have, quote unquote, seen some things. Again, I told him he was crazy and tried to change the subject. However, he told me that he saw a ghost for real when he came here previously with his family, and that I shouldn't disrespect the dead like that. I and a couple other people laughed, but I noticed that Harold was no longer smiling. His face was completely serious, and as we turned back to each other to talk about other things, Harold instead put on his headphones and hugged his knees to his chest in complete silence for the rest of the trip that day. Fast forward to the end of the day. We stayed on campus this particular night. My roommate for the trip, who I'll call Cole, and I fell asleep pretty early since we were so tired from walking around all day. I woke up in the middle of the night to a knocking on our door. I looked across the room and my roommate Cole was still completely asleep. I got up to answer it, assuming that maybe it was the trick coordinator or something. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. I peeked out into the hallway and looked it up and down, but there was nothing. I shut the door and returned to bed, assuming I was just hearing things. That, or just losing my mind. A few moments later, there was another knock at the door. I got up to answer it, but again, there was nothing. I started to feel a combination of both annoyed and weirded out, but I returned to my bed to get some more sleep. I hadn't had my eyes closed for more than a minute when there was another soft knock at the door. At this point, I was mildly annoyed. I figured maybe it was someone playing some college-level form of ding-dong ditch or something, so I didn't move from my bed. After a moment of silence, there was another brief knock, but I didn't respond to it. That's when the knocking became a banging noise. I sat straight up and looked at the door. The banging continued loudly, and each rap at the door was so hard that you could visibly see the door moving. At this point, even my roommate sat straight up. We both stared at the door, now calm, just waiting. That's when it happened. The door slowly began to open. It wasn't by much, and honestly, if I hadn't heard the creak, I wouldn't have noticed it even moved. But when it did, the room suddenly felt cold. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. My arms and legs began to prickle as goosebumps erupted all over them. I looked over at Cole. He was still staring at the door and slowly looked over at me. We couldn't make out each other's faces in the dark that well anyway, but we could see each other's eyes. and his looked completely terrified. Then, the room suddenly felt heavy. I felt myself having to try harder to breathe and take in the air. And I could see that Cole was having the same problem. I could see that he had moved his hand on his chest and was completely hunched over in his bed. I asked him if he was okay, but instead of a response, Cole just began heaving heavily, and it sounded like no air was going into his lungs at all. Then, Cole threw his head back and began screaming. I don't think I'll ever get the sound out of my head of his screams. This wasn't one of your typical screams that you hear in a movie or when your friend jumps out of the bushes to scare you. No, Cole sounded like he was in tremendous pain. He laid back on the bed, convulsing and wriggling all over it, his screams growing louder and louder with every second. By mere instinct, I got out of my bed to try to help him. I kept shouting his name, but Cole wouldn't listen to me. He just kept screaming about all the blood and bodies, all the death that surrounded him, pleading for it to go away. I put my hands on his shoulders to try and hold him down, but Cole was way stronger than I was. That, and I noticed that he was on fire. I mean, it felt like I had put my hand over hot, boiling water. I almost couldn't stand to touch his skin, he was so hot. Then, the banging at the door continued, but this time, it was followed by voices. With the trick coordinator and the dorm RA. They were yelling for me to open the door. I immediately raced over to try and open it, but I was met with some type of force. I don't really know how to describe it, but it felt like I had hit a huge brick wall. I fell over as Cole continued with his convulsions, yelling for the death to stop. I tried again to get to the door as the coordinator and RA continued hitting it again, but was blocked once more. This time, I fell back and hit my head on the end of my bed. It didn't knock me out, but to this day, I can't 100% say if what I saw was real or just delirium from hitting my head. When I looked up, I saw a shadow figure against the door to our room. It was completely massive. It was so tall that it spanned from the floor to the ceiling and first appeared to be a giant blob. But as I continued to stare, I could tell that it was actually in the shape of a man. Cole was still screaming in rhythmic pain next to me, but I was too focused on the shadow figure to pay much attention to him. The figure was definitely a man, but he looked somehow different. He was clearly wearing a hat, but it almost looked like one of those pirate hats, like the kind Jack Sparrow wore in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. The figure didn't move, but I could tell it was not a pleasant entity, if in fact that's what it was. I suddenly felt scared and desperately wanted nothing but to be out of the room. I couldn't think straight between Cole's screaming and the banging coming from the other side of the door. But this figure, it was dark and it was evil. And then, just as soon as it appeared, it vanished. The door handle jiggled and then swung open as the RA for the dorm used our spare key to get into our room. The coordinator rushed past me to Cole's side, who was still screaming in pain and agony. The RA found me on the floor and asked me what had happened. I ignored him and looked into the hallway. There were several people standing in the hall, presumably because they heard Cole's wails. Among them was Harold, and he was staring at me. I wanted to say something to him, but the RA wouldn't let go of my shoulders. Harold only stayed for a few seconds, then turned around and walked away as if nothing had happened. The coordinator and RA ended up calling for campus paramedics to come and tend to Cole. He had calmed down significantly once they arrived, but he was still muttering to himself. They placed him on the gurney, and as they wheeled him out, I could hear him still whisper of death and despair, of blood, and of war. The coordinator allowed me to sleep in his room that night, but demanded I tell him what happened in the morning. When the morning came, though, things only got stranger. I woke up and the coordinator was not in the room, so I got dressed and packed my bags, ready to head out with the rest of the students for the remainder of the trip. When I walked outside with everyone else, I heard everyone whispering to one another, and some of them were staring at me. I knew why they were staring, but not exactly why they were whispering. I looked everywhere for Harold to find some answers, but before I could find him, I heard another boy whisper to someone near him. He said that Cole, my roommate, had gone home early and that his parents drove down here to get him. I stopped dead in my tracks and looked at him. He saw me staring at him and hurried away. That's when I felt a large hand clamp down on my shoulder. It was Harold. I asked Harold if it was true that Cole was going home for the remainder of the trip, but Harold didn't answer the question. Instead, he leaned in and whispered something in my ear, something I don't think I'll ever forget. Harold grabbed me by my shirt collar and forced me closer to him. And in one chilling sentence, he left me with these words: "I told you not to disrespect the dead." I jumped back as Harold turned to board the bus. The rest of the trip was weird, and I didn't get much out of it. I was forced to the room with the coordinator as no one else wanted me in their rooms for the night. They all thought I had hurt Cole in his sleep or drugged him or something. And when we returned home, Cole didn't come to school for another 3 weeks. And when he did, he wasn't the same as he was before. Cole and I weren't friends, but he was always loud and outgoing, so I knew who he was before the trip. But when he came back, he wouldn't talk to anyone. He just went through the motions until summer came. His family ended up moving away over the summer, but I'll always wonder whatever happened to him. I'm a freshman in college now, but that trip still haunts me. Was there really a ghost or spirit in our room? What happened to Cole? What was that shadow figure? I know one thing, though. I'll never disrespect the dead again.